Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football podcast by Isaiah Maldonado, our Post-Gazette and daily Collegian Nittany Lions insider, to recap the loss to Iowa, set you up for this bye week ahead of the, I can't call it a showdown anymore, Isaiah, between Penn State and Ohio State. It's just a game. Ohio State matters. Penn State does not officially anymore after this loss to Iowa this past weekend. So we're going to get into all of that. Just want to remind you that this show is presented by FanDuel. More on them in a little bit. Isaiah, it was ugly in pretty much all facets the other day. I think it was ugliest at quarterback for Ethan Grunkemeyer. Struggled in his debut. Not an easy place to do it on the road at Kinnick Stadium. It was his debut as the starter. Obviously, he's played a little bit in his Penn State career to this point, but finishes 15 of 28 for 93 yards. The 2 interceptions, took a sack, just not very effective. The offense did manage to score some points with him in there, but I don't know. It was not good. How did that performance leave you feeling about him, knowing that because of the coaching change with James Franklin, he may or may not be back next season. Who knows? He may follow James Franklin wherever he ends up. Did you see anything from him in that game the other night that made you say, I'd like to see more of this kid in a bigger sample size? And if you're a Penn State fan, maybe he's someone you want to keep around.
I don't think it was as bad as people made it out to be. Now, obviously, if you didn't watch the game and you're just kind of looking at box score and you see the 2 interceptions, the 54% completion percentage, it's not a glamorous game. Even watching the game, it's not that I think he did exceptionally well by any means. But both picks, I don't want to say are negligible, but one of them was on the 4-yard line, basically, like even Terry Smith said it himself, essentially the same as punting. It was a very low-risk pick. And then the other one just kind of ended up just going into the hands of a defender through no fault of really Grunk's fault himself. So objectively, not too bad interceptions. Obviously, it's never good to see interceptions on the stat sheet, but just in terms of an overall, it wasn't that bad. But I do think the biggest thing was his comfortability within the offense, making those reads, his progressions. Was not comfortable hitting receivers in open space. Terry Smith spoke about it himself, saying that there really was no efficiency in the passing offense. Definitely not deep, and even in the intermediate zone, was not reliable in being able to move the ball up the court. Excuse me, sorry. Basketball season just started, so already happy to talk watching basketball. But it was definitely rough to watch at some point in times. I think he played with poise. I think obviously being in Kinnick Stadium at night in that environment is something where you could expect somebody of his inexperience and his stature to play a lot worse. But I think he was able to handle the noise very well. I think he did an effective job of leading when he was in there. Penn State was able to cap off some scoring drives with him at the quarterback position. But I do think that any sort of thoughts of the matter on if this was a Drew Allar problem should be kind of put to rest right now. Like, this is a game that if Penn State has Drew Allar, I'm very confident that they win this. And that's something that a lot of people, even if had he not gotten down with the season-ending injury, people probably still would have said Penn State loses this game. Drew Allar plays with poise for the majority of the time. Franklin said it over and over again, but statistically, he is one of the best in Penn State program history when it comes to completion percentage and touchdown to interception ratio. I feel like he wouldn't have made those mistakes. But in terms of just his play, I don't think it was that bad. I think there's definitely some comfortability, some things to be worked out between him and the receivers. Terry Smith said they're going to get some of the new names in there. We saw a catch from Kobe Howard. We want to see a little bit more of Tysier Denmark. But overall, I don't think it was the worst debut in, that could have been happened from Grunk. I think it was okay.
Yeah, I had the same thoughts about Drew Allar, and I think he's going to go down as probably one of the more unappreciated quarterbacks in Penn State history. A lot of people compare him to Christian Hackenberg, to Anthony Morelli. I don't think it was ever really that bad with him. Yes, those you include the Oregon game, plus the losses to UCLA and Northwestern, short circuits the season, not good. But on balance, I think he was much more effective than both of those guys, and it's a shame that he will not be remembered in the same breath as some of those guys who've done similarly impressive things at Penn State. I think about Michael Robinson, Darrell Clark. He's won at the level that those guys did at Penn State. It just wasn't quite enough. But guess what? Those guys didn't win national championships either. Yeah. I think he belongs more in that conversation than he does in the Hackenberg and Morelli. But, maybe people will need to see more of someone who's not Drew Allar to really appreciate him in hindsight. Isaiah, I wanted to ask you about Jackson Smolik mixing in a bunch. We saw Penn State do it last season with Bo Pribula. They had success with it at times. What did you think of mixing him in as much as they did? I think I saw a stat that he played more in this game than Bo Pribula did in any game that Drew Allar was healthy for last season. Obviously, Bo Pribula played the whole second half in Wisconsin, but that doesn't really count for the purposes of kind of switching things up and mixing in. Jackson Smolik played a lot. Do you think it may have disrupted Ethan Grunkemeyer's flow and ability to get into this game a little bit?
I said it live watching the game. I said I don't like this at any point in time. I feel like I think it was a little bit different when it came to Drew and Bo, for the purpose of, I think both of them were individually better quarterbacks than Ethan and Jackson. So I think they had the talent and they had a little bit more experience to be able to kind of throw that up there. I mean, granted, Drew at the time was a little bit younger, but a former 5-star, somebody who's very highly touted, undeniably more talented than somebody like Ethan or Smolik coming in. So I think because you have these two guys who aren't as comfortable within the system, just flat out didn't have the success that Drew Allar had in high school, and then isn't as raw, doesn't have the raw talent, doesn't have the raw, intangibles.
The arm,
the arm, the 6'5", the 240, the 235, they need to get comfortable within the system, because there's really nothing else to fall back on aside from being talented enough to make it to Penn State in the first place. Obviously every quarterback who's on the roster was deemed talented enough to compete in the Big Ten at the highest level. So no knock on their game in that aspect. But I think when you have two players that really haven't seen any substantial game time, especially this season, you're going to hinder both of them. Whether considering that Grunk is going to be the full-time starter going forward, commit to that. I feel like by having Jackson come in and check in at times, you create this kind of distrust in Grunkemeyer's head of, are they doing this because there's a lack of faith in me? Or are they doing this because they see something as small that they don't see in me? And then even if that's not the thought process going through his head, it's still I'm not able to consistently get in the zone. I'm not able to consistently go out there, get in the next play, learn from my mistakes. And in fact, I'm actually if I'm in his shoes, I'm sitting there thinking about my mistakes and then having to check back in just coming off the bench. I wasn't a big fan of it. I think it messed a lot in terms of letting Ethan get into a groove. And do I think that it was a deciding factor in them losing this game? No, I think that's a very big stretch. But I think purely for the point of confidence, you would want to be able to play Ethan as much as possible and not be so quick to say, all right, come out the game, we're going to try something else.
Well, and I don't know. I feel like Andy Kotelnicki is kind of being like a washed up pop star here and just trying to play the hits. Obviously, you think back to the interception that Drew Allar threw. That was a play they ran very effectively with Tyler Warren through a whole swath of last season. But guess what? You didn't have Tyler Warren. Now you're coming back and trying to, like you mentioned, you're trying to replicate what you did with Drew Allar and Bo Pribula last season, but you have neither of those guys. So he just doesn't seem to have a lot of creativity beyond the stuff that worked last season. He doesn't seem to be coaching the team's current personnel. He seems to just be trying to fit it to what worked last season. And I think that is in a lot of ways what has doomed Penn State at very crucial points, in this 0-4 start to Big Ten play. Isaiah, let's talk a little bit about the receivers that Grunkemeyer had to throw to. Is this the most disappointing group of these transfers yet? I believe Ross and Pena are on pace for their production to basically be cut in half from what they did at their other schools last year. Kyron Hudson is on pace to match his numbers, but he only had 400-ish yards for USC last season. I think that they have got to be a part of this conversation of why this passing game works. Not only not for Ethan Grunkemeyer, but also going back, to when Drew Allar was still healthy and the starter. I think I mentioned on this podcast a couple of weeks ago that the play that Grunkemeyer came in for in the Northwestern game was, to me, emblematic of the broader problem with this offense, which is they can't get guys open consistently. Mm-hmm. He had that same deer in the headlights, there's no one open look that I've seen Drew Allar have 1,000 times in big games and even smaller games this season, where no one's open and he has to figure out what to do with the ball. I saw it from Grunkemeyer on that play. These guys none of them had more than 20 yards in the game at Iowa. How are you grading this group? Because I give them a big fat F at this point.
I don't know if I would say an F, but it ain't far off. They might get like a D- from me. I think when you look at the production that they had at other schools, Devonte Ross was top at the Sun Belt in pretty much every category, at least like top 3 in receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. I believe he was either first or second in receiving touchdowns. Kyron Hudson was always kind of a projection guy when Penn State got him. It was always a matter of maybe he'll blossom into this. He showed signs, he showed glimpses. So I can't really critique too much on somebody who's never played at that level, but specifically for Ross and Pena, I do think that on an individual level, especially with Ross, I think Ross probably gets the most leeway from me, from just him being a little bit banged up in preseason and then going in and kind of struggling those first 2 games. But he's done big play time after. Again, has he always been the most consistent? No, but I think in terms of generating that big play potential, being able to be a downfield, I can't even say reliable, but be a downfield target for Allen for 30, 40 plus yards. At least we've seen it. Like it actually came into fruition a couple of times. And I think now, and I'm trying to debate whether I think it's an individual level of them just failing to get open, or if I really put a lot of the blame on Kotelnicki for this, because I just feel like there's always been that hesitancy, even when Allar was healthy and coming into the season as a Heisman hopeful, somebody who could potentially be a top 10 draft pick. There was still that hesitancy, that not wanting to pass deep, to always try to target the intermediate zone, to rely on short passes. And I can't even say rely on the run, because early on they started to shy away from the run too. If you're shying away from the run, but you're shying away from deep passes, your offense becomes incredibly stagnant and it becomes just incredibly telegraphed. So I do think that there is a disappointing aspect to the receivers in terms of their own individual production and what they've been able to do on the field. But I do think that we've seen them be utilized correctly on a play-by-play basis. And if that was being kind of enforced throughout the course of an entire game, or being enforced consistently throughout the season, then I do think that they would look a lot better. But I do think that Kotelnicki has to be the most to blame for this. I mean, he spoke to media earlier today, and when asked about the struggles of Penn State's offense, it was, I don't know. And kind of just that next play mentality. You can't really have that next play mentality without learning.
They haven't made the play.
The play hasn't been made.
Next plays. Yes.
I've yet to see the next play. I feel like we've been saying next play, next game, want to know mentality since week 1, and it's the same thing. So I really do place a lot of this blame to your point. Comfortability by Kotelnicki. I feel like he just thinks that this is the same old Penn State, and there's new personnel, there's new players, and they're not being catered to.
Well, and I think you bring up an important point about the micromanaging. I remember, I think it was before this whole skid started, James Franklin talking about the lack of confidence that Drew Allar had that was clear, even early in the season against some of these teams that Penn State simply outclassed. Mm-hmm. He mentioned that, we're getting into third and short, or we're not putting him in third in manageable situations. They're obvious passing. Those were the words I was searching for. He said obvious passing downs, as if they were like the worst thing that ever happened to a quarterback, and completely unfair to expect a 5-star senior quarterback
to be able to make that
handle a 3rd and 7.
Yeah,
like, you were talking about 3rd and 7 like it was moving up a mountain, and I think that speaks to the mentality that maybe it's Andy Kotelnicki, maybe it was James Franklin gripping the club too tight. but it does seem like they have tried to micromanage this offense and tried to, this obsession with staying on schedule has prevented them from just playing football at times like they did in the second half of the Oregon game, where they started to let it fly. You mentioned Devonte Ross has made some downfield plays. He made the big one to get them back in that one. We haven't seen nearly enough of that from Penn State, and you wonder why Andy Kotelnicki would still be managing the game like that when there's nothing to lose, when your head coach is going for fourth downs constantly because he knows there's nothing for this team to lose at this point. Everyone's probably getting fired for the most part. So just the grip it and rip it to some extent, but he still seems completely unwilling to do that. So maybe it is on him now that he's still here and Franklin's gone. Maybe it was James Franklin, and one of the critiques of big games is that he gets too tight in them. But whoever it is, the receivers have just not. It isn't just Andy Kotelnicki either. They've been terrible going back to, I think, about the Peach Bowl a couple of years ago, where they didn't register any catches until the game was well out of reach. It's been a consistent pattern with this group. I think what makes them more disappointing to me than some of the other ones is that they did have some top end production that you could point to. I think especially with Trebor Pena, I thought, okay, he might be the best guy they've had here in a handful of years, but that hasn't manifested. So a good conversation there, Isaiah. I wanted to ask you about a couple other guys. Luke Reynolds, quickly. It was probably always unfair to hold him to the Tyler Warren standard. Did you expect more from him this season, though, or is he possibly the victim of the same stuff we've been talking about with the receivers?
I think he's absolutely a victim of expectation. I think when you have a player as just, I don't like to throw the word generational out there, but what Tyler Warren was able to do was nothing short of spectacular. And we know it's not a fluke, if you will. He's doing it at the NFL level too. I have him in fantasy. It's a blessing. I love him. So I think to that point, it was unfair to ever expect Luke Reynolds to be able to come in and kind of match any sort of that production. Obviously, when you're going up against non-conference teams, lower ranked defenses, defenses that don't necessarily have the answer to somebody like Luke Reynolds, then obviously he's going to look a lot better than he will against teams that do have higher rated defense, do have the answers for him. And then to the point of just passive play calling, he's obviously going to be limited, not be able to get into the groove that they would like. I think they've kind of even shied away from targeting the tight end as much as they did in the past. I think this game he only ended up with 3 targets. He had 3 receptions, so at least 100% catch completion, but didn't necessarily do too much with it. But yeah, I would never expected him to be able to come in and fully take that role. And then, I mean, to the point of play calling, the 4th and 1 with his rush attempt was, I saw him get a lot of hate for that when, at least in my opinion, you correct me if I'm wrong, I really feel like that was a line problem more so than him trying to pick apart another gap and change the play on the fly. Poor blocking has been very synonymous with Penn State this season, at least poor blocking in the sense of what their expectations were. It's not like they've been a horrendous offensive line, but definitely not to the extent of one of the best in the country that a lot of people expected them to be. So I think you put all of that together, and then you just round it off with the fact that this is somebody who's good, who was able to get to Penn State, has had some really good games against non-conference teams. But aside from that, a lot of these expectations and beliefs in him were unsubstantiated. And then you place everything that's been going on the same way it's probably affecting a lot of these other guys. This is somebody that most likely came to Penn State because of James Franklin, who came in with all of these expectations and is shaken up. Luke Reynolds is a sophomore. He's not somebody who I expect to be super solidified and be able to handle this at the highest rate possible, handle this with the poise that some other players might be able to. So I think there's a lot of factors that contribute to him not being the guy.
I think he is a victim of, comparison to Tyler Warren, when maybe a guy like Mike Gesicki is probably the better comp. I remember vividly Mike Gesicki struggled early on. There was frustration with him because you knew he was talented. You had hopes that he would turn into what he did in leading Penn State to that Big Ten championship, but he was not that for his first couple of seasons. So, will we get to see it with Luke Reynolds? Who knows? I think that's what makes a lot of this conversation feel pointless at times, Isaiah, because you don't know if any of these guys are going to be on next season's team. You don't know if there's going to be a future that they're building toward, but if Luke Reynolds does end up being at Penn State next season, I think you hope he can end up on that Gesicki trajectory. One other guy I wanted to ask you about before I switch sides to the other side of the ball here. Man, I just feel like this was the game that you really said it's Kaytron Allen, and that's it right now. I think Nick Singleton has not produced for a good chunk of the season, but I think it's gotten lost at times in everything else that's been going on, all of the other conversations about all these other games and coaches getting fired and the quarterbacks. But in this one, Kaytron Allen has a huge game. I got the stats right here. 28 carries, 145 yards, 5.2 per carry. Nick Singleton only gets 6 for 15 yards. Clearly, there might have been some level of philosophy change there in managing that group. It seemed like James Franklin always wanted to use those guys as equally as he could. He is gone. You have Terry Smith in here. Lean heavily on Kaytron Allen. I believe Nick Singleton's average for the season is down to 3.6 per carry. What's happened here, Isaiah?
I mean, first and foremost, I just feel like Nick Singleton definitely regrets not coming back for another year. I think had you look at his prior production and just in totality at Penn State, but specifically that last year, he probably ends up going as a 3rd round pick, 4th round pick, somewhere in that same areas that Cam went, somewhere in that range. And now we're probably looking at him as a solidified day 3 pick. It's probably 6th, 7th round. I think he'll be fine coasting off of what he's done. But I think the biggest problem is just the lack of utilization of Nick Singleton. He's we can credit his physicality, we can credit his ability to break tackles, but he is a speed back who is routinely getting sent up the middle of a disappointing offensive line. Kotelnicki said it himself this morning, saying that they need to do a better job of sending him to the sidelines and bursting out in open space and showing that speed. And it's aggravating because that's your job. You're saying what you need to do to be able to get Nick Singleton better looks and for him to match the production and be the player that everybody knows he can be, but you're not doing it. If you're aware that you need to design plays for him to be able to break out into open space and show what he can do, then why keep sending him up the middle for a consistent gain of 1 or 2? I think Kaytron himself has somebody that's blossomed to an all-purpose back in terms of utilizing him, sending him straight down the middle as a power back, being able to break away in open space, reading secondaries. I think when it comes to a pure just talent level that he's surpassed Nick Singleton. I think Singleton, because of his kind of not inability, but his main focus being his speed, and with the offensive line not being as great, it's easier to kind of send Kaytron up the middle and say, hey, go be great. But at the end of the day, there's a reason those two were splitting carries. And it's because they're both incredibly talented. And to see them shy away from Singleton, and he struggled even in non-conference play, if we're being honest, to be able to, offensive production-wise, carry-wise, yards per carry, he was still looking a little bit rough there, but we had offensive line problems in from week 1. So in terms of being able to get him back on track, you need to utilize him in a better manner. But I will say the one thing that I was happy to see from this game, if you will, is because Kaytron has consistently been the guy this year, the one Penn State player on offense who has not even just met expectations, but has risen past expectations, there was a reluctancy for James Franklin to feed him. And if there wasn't going to be any shift in play calling to utilize Nick Singleton and you were going to keep sending him up the middle, then I didn't understand in the first place why a change like this hadn't happened sooner. It makes sense for Kaytron to be the focal point of the offense, given what he's been able to do. And it worked. Over 5 yards a carry, 145 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns on the ground. He was able to single-handedly keep Penn State in against, I believe Iowa was either the 5th or 6th ranked rushing defense in the country. They only, before Penn State, they only allowed 70 rushing yards per game. Penn State went off for 173, and 145 of those were Kaytron Allen. So I do think that the shift towards Kaytron was necessary, but it should never get to that point to begin with, because it should have been addressed at a play calling level first and foremost.
Isaiah, let's switch sides of the ball real quick. Again, I think now that James Franklin is no longer the focal point of a lot of people's rage, that Drew Allar is no longer there, you're focusing more on these other characters. I have a lot of questions about the future of Jim Knowles here at Penn State, because, early in the season I could have said, oh, well, you got to get your system in place. And then I would have said right after the James, and I did on this podcast, I said when James Franklin was fired, I said, I don't know if Jim Knowles is a goner yet, because they're paying him so much money, but you're not seeing any improvement here. You're having these key failures. Particularly, you had the game to be won there at the end, and you have the huge failure on the long Gronowski run that sets them up, and it's not getting better. And I wonder when it will. Let's just play out a hypothetical where he's still the defensive coordinator under whoever the new coach is. If you lose half of the players through the portal this offseason, Isaiah, and you're completely retooling this defense, are we going to be having the same conversation a year from now about Jim Knowles' defense? And you got to get it in place. You got to get the culture established. I'm frustrated. I tweeted this. I said, if you'd said 4 years ago that he was going to be the guy at Penn State to set you up for this season when you had such high expectations, I would have been all about it. I have a ton of respect for the guy. It just seems like it is harder than it should be with him right now and the athletes that he has had available. This might be the best Penn State defense he gets to coach for a couple of years. So what's your read on him and his standing as we continue into this coaching search?
I think that this is going to end up, next year specifically is going to end up being, one could say, a make or break year. I feel like there's questions on why the Penn State players haven't been able to execute Knowles' scheme and have it be what it was when he was at Ohio State. Obviously, we spoke about this before, but we know it works. We've seen it work. So if we know the scheme works, then the only thing that we can point at is either Knowles doing a poor job of enforcing it and teaching it to the players, or the players just simply not being a good fit for the scheme. Now, I do think that, granted, because a lot of these players are going to declare for the draft, transfer out, given that Franklin is gone, we will be looking almost guaranteed at a completely retooled, repurposed, brand new Penn State defense with a lot of new guys and positions that they didn't have beforehand. And I think if that unit is going to struggle to execute Knowles' scheme, it looks even worse on him. Because not only is it, and you can make the argument that whatever guys come in are probably going to be less talented than the Penn State defense that they currently have right now. But if it's a matter of just the individual players not being able to learn the scheme, and then you get 40 plus new guys in and then 10 plus new starters, and they still can't execute it, at that point, is it a lack of talent in being able to execute it, or is it just being poorly taught and poorly enforced? Is he not a good fit for the culture? Is it rubbing guys the wrong way? Because they had nothing but positive things to say about the scheme before entering the season. And even in the first 3 weeks of non-conference play, they were still very just vocal about their support for the system. So I do think that next year, when there's a brand new unit of guys, if these struggles persist, it might just be, it's not the scheme itself, it's Knowles doing a poor job of enforcing it. And I think that brings his job into question a lot more than it does right now. Because to your point, there's so much money wrapped up in him. You don't want to make that move on from him unless it's absolutely necessary.
Isaiah, can this team still make a bowl game? I think this was the pivot point game for me. Of if you could have found a way to win that one, then you only have to get 2 the rest of the way to get the bowl eligibility. The schedule lightens up after Ohio State and Indiana, but you end up losing. So that means you now basically have to run the table after Indiana and Ohio State. Possibly you'd have to win 3 in a row after you've lost 5 in a row with an interim coach, with all of these issues we've spent the last half hour talking about. I'm starting to become pretty doubtful. Penn State's a 17.5-point underdog to Ohio State right now, according to our friends at FanDuel. So FanDuel's not even believing in this roster at this point. It's a bit because if you looked at that spread in the preseason, it might have been 3, 4, 5 somewhere in that neighborhood. So it has ballooned significantly. So they think Penn State's significantly worse. I think at this point it's unlikely they're going to make the postseason.
Oh, I totally agree. I have zero faith in them. Looking at their schedule after Ohio State and Indiana, those are like as 99.9% losses as I'm possibly sure. Then nothing's 100% in the world, but it looks pretty likely. And then I think the only team that I have confidence that Penn State can beat is Rutgers. I mean, Michigan State's not the greatest either. I think Nebraska surprised some people, and they've been solid. I think Nebraska is currently constructed, though might not be as talented on paper, is just been able to produce more and pull out consistent wins. So I would give Nebraska the edge over us, over Penn State right now. Rutgers is really the only one that I could sit there and say I have confidence in Penn State to beat. There is definite reality, and they could sneak one by Michigan State as well. But I do think it is very likely that Penn State ends up as a 4-win team, which doesn't sound real. That wasn't. I think when we gave our preseason or ahead of week 1, our takes of what we thought the expectations were, neither of us sat there and said we thought Penn State was going to win the national championship. But I believe we both said that they were going to make a similar run that they did last year. At least I gave as far as a semifinals appearance again. So to go from saying that they could go 11-1, I said if they were able to beat Oregon, they would go 12-0. Like, man, this is it, the fall off is it the rate. The spread for the Ohio State game deserves to balloon as high as it did. Penn State has fallen off drastically, and at this point, a bowl appearance would be a gift from above.
This thing on, I think they can beat IU. I'm not going to predict it yet. I think they can beat IU. I think they can catch them napping a little bit, like IU did in the first game of 20. I'm thinking of that first game in 2020 when Penn State was nationally ranked. I think they can. I'm not saying I think they will quite yet. I'm going to have to see a little signs of life against Ohio State, but I'm not. And this leads well into the final question I have for you, Isaiah. Curt Cignetti signs the $11.6 million per year extension with IU, an 8-year deal. I don't love that for them. I think that's a lot of money for a year and a half of solid results, but you still only won one huge game against Oregon. And I'm not, if Penn State has to pay $12 million to get this guy here, he's off my radar. What about you?
I don't think, given his age, I would still throw him a bag. It doesn't, to me, I feel like you just need somebody to come in and reestablish the culture that Penn State had. I think from the perspective of Indiana, and in not being one of these historic storied programs that have been able to have continued dominance for any just sustained period of time, this is somebody, Curt is going to be somebody who's going to be able to keep drawing in these guys. And even if you don't think that he's somebody who's going to turn IU into exactly what I said, a powerhouse, a storied guy, I think he's at least going to change the culture. So when the next guy comes in, if he's half as competent and he's half as good of a coach, I think they could elevate to being one of the consistent better teams in the Big Ten. Not to the level of what Oregon is right now, or what they've been able to do. But I think he's somebody who is undoubtedly he has reshaped their culture. And I think that's exactly what Penn State needs. I'm seeing still the rumors of Matt Rule. I've seen more Marcus Freeman. Everything just they need. And though I don't think Matt Rule is somebody who's going to come in and change the culture, I think somebody like Marcus Freeman absolutely would. But then it begets the question of these guys that are at other programs that are currently top programs. Even if we don't want to count IU as one historically, there's no doubt right now that they are one of the best teams in college football. So I think it'll be hard to draw him away. I think he's happy with the legacy he's building at Indiana. I think it's going to be much of the same story with a lot of these other guys at different schools. I think they're going to be hesitant to come into Penn State with the way it's currently built. I think you're going to have to deal with a lot of scrutiny if you come here and you're unable to set things up and get things back on track. So I don't know. I think Penn State needs someone to come in and change the culture. And I think somebody like Curt, what he's been able to do the past 2 years, they need somebody like that if they can't get him.
$12 million is a lot of money. And that would be my struggle with it. I am not a Matt Rule guy. We talked about that last week on the podcast, but $12 million. If you could have gotten him for $8, all the things that you're saying, I could have signed up for. If you could have got him for 8, 9, maybe even the 10, something like that, somewhere in the normal range, I would have said, okay, maybe I see it, an older guy who you're taking a chance on because he's won in this burst. But there's also a reason that it took him this long to get a job even as good as IU was when he took it. And that would be a big bet after you already made that type of contract offer with James Franklin and saw how that worked out. I think you say good luck IU with this. Hopefully it works out for you, but he's off my list at that price. But I hear you. I mean, I hear the points that you're making. It's just, do I like those points at $12 million? Do I want to hear culture at $12 million?
No, I get it. At the end of the day, I just feel like this is such a pivotal point for Penn State. I do believe that the next guy that they bring in, if he's not able to really reset things, we could be looking at a dark time for Penn State. So I think there needs to be an emphasis on getting a guy who can at least try and reel things in and weather the storm while that storied history is so close. Literally just college football playoffs, semifinals appearance last season. That needs to be honed in on. And if you bring in a guy who is not able to capitalize on that, and we're looking at Penn State being a mid-Big Ten team, a consistent potentially anywhere from 6 to 8 wins, I think it's a lot harder to come back from that than where it is right now.
See, I guess where I'd also disagree with you is I don't know that it was a culture problem in terms of the rest of college football compared to the IUs of the world. I think James Franklin had a good culture here. I think they came up small in the big games, and that wore thin, and I think for good reason. But I don't know if the culture is as bleak and as bad as maybe it might seem right now. And maybe I'm also saying that as someone who lived through and covered 2011, 2012, the Jerry Sandusky scandal at Penn State. You could have said you needed a new culture then, but the culture Penn State had at that point, and guys like Mike Mowdy, Zordich, that held that team together. The difference now is how many of the people that are in that room are going to stay. That colors all of these conversations. So, Isaiah, I look forward to continuing to detail it with you for the rest of the season. If you're joining us for the first time here on the channel, please subscribe. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. And please check out our written work at post-gazette.com. I'll be back with Paul Zeiss here on the channel on Friday. So looking forward to more Penn State talk. Hopefully you'll join us then.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.